Good morning.
Here's the testifier.
I am going to call to order the Ag and Food Finance and Policy Division. Good morning, everyone. We are going to have a couple of bills this morning, and then we're going to have some discussion after that to talk about chronic wasting disease. But we know that we have a quorum, and we have minutes to approve. So, Representative Brand.
Madam Chair, I move the minutes from March 26th, 2019.
All right, those are in your packet. Anyone have any corrections, additions, changes? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, nay. The motion prevails. The minutes are adopted. So we do have three bills that we're going to start with, and I'm just going to start with House File 1581. And I will move that House File 1581 be referred to the Ways and Means Committee. And I have an amendment. We've talked about this before. We've had this kind of bill before us. The reason we're doing it is we like to have options. So we're going to make sure that we have another option on the table. And so is there, so I'd like to, what will happen with the A1 amendment, that just puts it into the same format that passed off the House about a month ago. So is there any discussion about that? Otherwise, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay? Okay, the motion prevails. So the bill is amended. And again, just a reminder, the idea is mental health is important. We again have heard about a situation where there was at least an attempt of a suicide. And so we really need to address this issue, and I would hope that, the House has been doing our work on this, and I think the Senate needs to kick it into gear a bit, and I hope that they do, because they certainly could do something right now and try to relieve some of the pressure that's going on for the farm advocates and for Ted Matthews as well. So that's what we're going to do. We have the bill, House File 1581, as amended before us. Any comments or questions? Anyone in the audience that wanted to testify? Yes, Representative Anderson.
Madam Chair, thank you. Just a comment. Since we worked on this earlier, I've had several people ask, is the amount large enough? Is it enough to get one more person on board, or is it adequate to address the needs?
Thank you, Representative Anderson, for that question. I would say especially now at this point, because we keep getting later and later, this only takes us through June 30th. So it would be enough. What we would do, it would take some time for the colleges, and we'll be able to hear Representative Poston has a bill, so we'll be able to, you can maybe ask some questions of his testifier as well. But I do believe that this would increase capacity for the farm advocates, and really what they have right now, they're limited in their dollars and their numbers of hours that they can serve. So this would increase the ability for them to have more hours, and that would be helpful. And then to hire a second person, and it would take some time to actually go through that process of hiring or putting out the RFP and doing all of that. So there's already time built into this, but unfortunately, we're getting closer to that June 30th date. So it's maybe not completely beyond the scope of, the money that we would have right now to be able to handle what we need to. Thank you for the question. Any other questions? All right, seeing none, I'd like to renew my motion that House File 1581 as amended be referred to the Ways and Means Committee. All in favor say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Any opposed, nay. The motion prevails, and that is going to be on its way. So now we are going to, Representative Hansen has House File 1292. This would be my intention to lay this bill over. Representative Hansen, please move your bill and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the committee, I would move House File 1292 to be laid over for possible inclusion in the Ag Omnibus Finance Bill.
Thank you. Do you want to describe your bill?
Thank you, Madam Chair. House File 1292 is passed through the Environment and Natural Resources Policy Committee. It's a fairly simple bill, and it relates to if there, let me just back up a little bit. With the pesticide law, the pesticide law is enforced by the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. And when the Department of Agriculture responds to a complaint, they have to go through a process where they determine whether or not that complaint is true and if there is damage, for example, if there is drift. What this bill does is doesn't change any of that process. It doesn't change any of that law. But what it does is it says when damage has occurred on public property in the outdoor recreation system, that there would be increased penalties. That simple. So it's not changing the drift law. It's not changing the procedure. The Department of Agriculture would still go through the same process. But when they determine that damage has occurred on public land, the land that belongs to all of us, then there would be increased penalties. And the rationale for this, we had heard testimony in other committees, the state of Minnesota has spent effort and money on trying to restore native prairie butterflies on wildlife management areas. And they are actually reestablishing them with a captive breeding program on wildlife management areas. And as they go in even a mile or two from the perimeter, they're still finding pesticide drift in that area. In the previous committee, the department testified that I think they had had 6 actual complaints on where there were damages on public land in the past few years. So this is increased penalties when damage has occurred. That's the bill.
Thank you, Representative Hansen. Questions or comments? Representative Keel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Hansen, tell me, I might have missed this earlier, but how do they define the drift when it is that far in and where it's coming from?
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, they determined through scientific analysis of the pesticides are not naturally occurring. The ones that they're detecting, they go through the analysis, find them, and look at the concentration that's occurring there. So you may have a product that is a chemical that is applied. They don't determine who applied that, but they would determine the pesticide that they're finding inside that site. But I want to also be real clear, the bill detection here is not damage. You have to have damages. So when you look on line 1.16, applies a pesticide resulting to damage on adjacent property that's part of the state outdoor recreation system.
Representative Keel.
Representative Hansen, thank you, Madam Chair. So what would the damages, what type of damages we'll be looking at? And then who does the testing for that in a public area?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Keel. That would be the Department of Agriculture. They have to do proof. They're going to have their staff go out. And I want to be clear, this is not determining there are many types of pesticide application. There could be a rights-of-way application, there could be an agriculture, there could be a lawn care, there could be a pest control. This is just saying any pesticide. It's not saying any type of pesticide. It's saying any pesticide if someone is producing damage on the public system. And so let's say there's a drift that occurs and you have a tree that dies that's in a state park or that's in a wildlife management area. So you have to prove that damage. And only when that damage is proved, then you would double the monetary price.
Do you have another question?
Yes, thank you.
Representative
Yes.
Keel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to throw a scenario out just out of curiosity. So the powers that be, maybe even a city or something, goes to spray mosquitoes and creates damage, but they're spraying the mosquitoes for sake of public safety. Then the city would be, whoever was spraying the mosquitoes would be liable doubly for damage to using that pesticide.
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Representative Keel. So an insecticide can be a pesticide, an herbicide can be a pesticide.
Correct.
A rodenticide can be a pesticide. So on a mosquito application where you're applying insecticide, and many times now that the cities or the Metropolitan Mosquito Control District are not applying adulticides anymore. They're applying a briquette that they throw in the wetland, and then that is a larvicide that impacts. So, but let's say there was I'll try to fill in on your hypothetical. Let's say there's an adulticiding for mosquitoes, and the drift occurs, and on that public land that a pheasant died. You would have to prove that it was the damage would have to be proved that it was the mosquito adulticide that killed that pheasant before this would even kick in. You have to prove that damage, and that's a hard standard to prove. But so again, only when that damage is proved that they can validate that this would kick in. It can't be just conjecture and say, there's a dead pheasant. It must have been from the adulticiding. You have to have that proof, and the department has those procedures. And my understanding of the procedure is usually when there's a response, this is only, again, when there are monetary penalties. So often there may be a written letter, a notice of violation, or a warning letter before you get to a monetary penalty.
Representative Keel.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Hansen. This feels a little fuzzy, and I'm well aware of the fact that when pesticides are sprayed and there might be a drift, in my world, we often call not just the department, Minnesota Department of Agriculture, but we also call in University of Minnesota, Crookston, where we're looking at a lot of different tests that happen. So it isn't just one entity that rules on whether or not a drift has happened or there are challenges. And sometimes it is, as Representative Hansen said, it is extremely hard to figure out where it came from. And so I want it on record that this is a very, very difficult identifier for agriculture, and it could become a problem. So thank you.
Thank you, Representative Keel. Representative Anderson. Did you? Oh, you weren't on the list. Okay. I have Representative Tabke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Hansen, in Representative Keel's scenario that she just put forward, what would happen with that today? Like, how would that be handled today without your bill, separate from your bill being enacted?
Representative Hansen.
Madam Chair and Representative Tabke, the Department of Agriculture has the authority under the underlying law to investigate. They're going to have to prove it. They may not be able to prove it. If they do prove it, they may have a menu of enforcement actions, whether it's a first offense or a multiple offense or a potential of damage. They would take that into account. So there would be a let's say they did a penalty, and I'm just using this as a hypothetical, that they do a penalty of $100 fine. And what this bill would then do is say that should be a $200 fine. And again, it's not changing the standard of proof. It is changing the penalty when there is an enforcement action.
Representative Tabke.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's what I was just going to confirm, is that your bill is not changing anything with the proving or who decides whether something has been injured or damaged or anything like that. Your bill is simply taking the penalty and doubling it for public land for protecting the public investment in public lands. Thank you.
Representative Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Hansen, how widespread is this problem currently? Number of complaints per year?
Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Representative Hamilton. The testimony in the Environment Committees, I think 6 incidents where there were damages, where there was a penalty, but I don't know that time period. I think it was in the last 4 to 5 years.
Representative Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Hansen, do we know what the average penalty was?
Representative Hansen, or did you want
Might
somebody from?
phone a friend. I think the Department of Ag would probably be available.
There's someone from the Department of Ag here to be able to answer that? welcome to the committee. Just state your name first and your position, and then answer the question if you heard it. Thank you.
Madam Chair, Joshua Stamper, I'm the Division Director for the Pesticide and Fertilizer Management Division within the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Over the last 5 years, we've had 6 of these cases. The average penalty amount for confirmed drift in those cases was about $625.
Is it total?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. Representative Hamilton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just clarification, so about 1 per year and about $100 per incident? Is that accurate?
Mr. Stamper?
$625 was the average penalty action per instance.
All right.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
for
Madam
that
Chair.
clarification. Thank you. Representative Miller?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a real quick question, Representative Hansen. And the department may have to answer this, the first part of this, but can you describe kind of the appeals process of a person who says the department has said damage has occurred? And if there's an appeals process and there's increased penalties, is this something that needs to go to public safety also?
Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Representative Miller, the Department of Ag has authority under, they have both civil and criminal and administrative authority. So this authority, again, is within their jurisdiction. We're just providing an increase on their administrative cost, on their administrative option. So I would not believe that it needs to go to public safety.
Okay.
Madam Chair, and I appreciate
Miller.
that. I understand what you just said, but if you could answer the first, because if there's an appeals process, sometimes it leaks outside the department, so I just want to know what the process is. Like, I get a bill from the Department of Investigation, I suppose, and then a bill from the Department of Agriculture, and they say you did this, and I said, I didn't do it. What's the process after that?
Thank you. Representative Hansen?
Thank you,
or
Madam Chair. And
Mr.
Representative
Stamper?
Miller, and if I'm wrong, the department could correct me here, but an investigation is usually closed until it's not open to the public until it's final. So if there's an investigation, if there's a claim, that's an active investigation that's going on, and until it's closed, until everything's done, that's not a public. They can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding.
Madam Chair, just a quick follow-up. And I'm
Representative
not
Miller.
concerned, I'm not concerned about that. I get the statement in the mail that says I'm being fined for this drift. Okay, I assume that I have some rights to say, no, I didn't. And I just want to know what that process is.
Thank you. Representative Hansen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, Representative Miller, they're actively engaged with the potential responsible party throughout that process, my understanding. And my experience now is Representative Hamilton and Representative Poppe is now 14 years old. But, we would be, when there was something that would happen, clearly you're involved with the potential responsible party, and it was closed, and then, when it's final, then it would be final. So.
The department has distributed here this pesticide drift pamphlet, so I don't know if Mr. Stamper wants to come up to just affirm what Representative Hansen has stated or make any clarifying comments about that. Welcome back.
Madam Chair, thank you. Distributed some pamphlets that kind of lays out our inspection process when there is a pesticide drift complaint. The responsibility that the Department of Ag takes on with this is to verify the source of the drift, and a lot of times we do that through some just basic gumshoe footwork by our inspectors of reaching out to local landowners, finding out who uses products, what products were used, corresponding dates of drift, when the physical impacts show up, and then subsequently we show up, do an inspection, collect physical evidence, and do our very best to establish the burden of proof that a product was used in a manner that is not consistent with the label. When we do our inspections, the burden of proof is, for us, being able to establish that the label was not followed.
All right. We have another question. Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and this is for Mr. Stamper. When you mentioned the size of the penalties you've assessed so far, that seems fairly large to me. Could you give us a rationale for how you come up with that number and how that's determined?
Mr. Stamper.
Madam Chair, Representative Anderson, if you reference Minnesota Statute 18D.315, that lays out the administrative penalty process, and we look at a couple different factors. One is the economic gain that's received by the person committing the violation. We consider the gravity in terms of actual or potential impact to human health and the environment. And then we also take into account culpability, good faith, and whether or not there is a history of violations. Historically, when we see the same type of violations committed over and over again, if the person who's committed the violations doesn't tell the truth, those are all things that tend to ramp up penalty actions. In the last 5 cases that have been referenced where we've had drift onto state lands, none of those kind of compounding factors have been at play.
Thank you. Representative Anderson.
Thanks again, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Stamper, in your opinion, my opinion is that fines are in place to deter action from happening again. Do you feel that the size of the fines you currently have the ability to place on folks that would have this situation, is that sufficient to defer that from happening again? You mentioned you haven't had any repeat offenders. So do you feel that the size of the fine currently available is sufficient?
Mr. Stamper.
Deterrence is largely a function of us being able to get in there and do education. Most folks don't set out to break the law. You know, that's just the nature of things. A lot of times you have issues with the wind changes direction, they don't pay attention. We do get drug into some instances where you have adjoining landowners that don't get along, and sometimes folks are naughty. The challenge with that is that I was going to use a term that I'm not going to use. Our goal with this is to establish was the law and the label followed, and that's where we go into it. The determinations are laid out in statute, and that's what we're going to follow as we go through there.
And Madam Chair, if I could follow.
Yes, Representative Hansen.
And so what we're doing here is that the outdoor recreation system lands are public lands. And so this is a policy decision that we have a choice that we have in front of us. So for those public properties where damage occurs, to put that in there as a component where we have an increased penalty because the land belongs to all of us. And so it may not be the conflict between neighbors, but it is public property that's being damaged. Therefore, you have that increased penalty.
Right. Representative Hamilton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just 2 final questions. First one is, do these fines, do they go into the general fund or stay with the department? That's one question. And then my other question is there anybody that opposes this bill?
Thank you. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and that could be corrected if I'm wrong, but they go back, I believe they go back into the pesticide regulatory account. Stay within department.
Thank you.
All right, and then we will see if anyone wants to testify in support or in opposition. I do know that we had an amendment in the packet. Is that something that's going to be offered, or do you want to offer that now? Is that you?
It's up to you, Madam Chair.
That would make sense. Then we'll have testimony on both. So Representative Anderson?
Thanks, Madam Chair. My amendment, the A1 amendment, is offered, if we're going to hold public property to a higher standard, I think it goes both ways. And what this amendment simply does is that if, in this case, MnDOT doesn't control the noxious weeds in their right-of-way, and they would seeds drift onto private property and cause spreads of weeds, noxious weeds, we think that the MnDOT should be willing to compensate the farmer or landowner for the damages that may incur or the cost of going out and cutting those thistles on their own. And that, Madam Chair, is why I offer the amendment.
Thank you, Representative Anderson. Representative Hansen, do you have a comment
Yes.
to that?
Madam Chair and Representative Anderson, I would oppose the amendment for two reasons. One, I think it deals with another section of law, the noxious weed law versus the pesticide law. And second, if the amendment was adopted, I think it would force a trip to the commissioner or to the Transportation Committee. The provisions relating to the outdoor recreation system were already heard in the Environment and Natural Resources Policy. However, if you wanted to introduce a bill like this, I would be happy to co-author it with you.
I don't know if there's anyone from MnDOT here who wanted to come down and give them the opportunity since they've been brought into this. So welcome to the committee. Please state your name, your position, and then hopefully provide some testimony regarding this amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Eric Radine with MnDOT Government Affairs, and we do have some concerns with the amendment. We have a system in place today where if there's a complaint from an adjoining landowner, we can certainly be responsive to that complaint. We perform about $2.5 million worth of noxious weed control, both through spraying and through spot mowing, or sometimes even hand cutting, burning, things like that. We think the current system works pretty well. Certainly, like I said, if there's a complaint, we can be responsive to that. And we also think it's important, the amendment isn't quite clear if the adjacent landowner would have to get a permit to go out and perform the work. And we think it's important that people do have a permit so that we have a way to communicate with people who are out doing work on our right-of-way. There may be instances where we've actually sprayed already, and the spray hasn't taken hold yet, or there may be a construction project coming up in that location, or there may be other things that people should be aware of before they're out performing work in the right-of-way.
Thank you. And did you want to also comment into the table? No. Okay. All right. Burdine, is it, Mr. Burdine?
Rudine.
Burdine. Sorry about that. All right. Representative Anderson, let's see, we have Representative Wozloak. Question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Anderson, I'm wondering if you have any idea how much, if this amendment were to be part of the bill, how much it would cost for this?
Representative Anderson.
Representative, I have no idea. We don't know how much of a weed situation would come up every year. And I've seen instances where in some areas thistles are the main thing I would be concerned about with this situation. And realizing MnDOT has a lot of miles of ditches to maintain. But again, my point with this is that I think it goes both ways here, that if we're going to hold public land to a higher standard in terms of damage done by private folks, it should go the other way also, that if public land impacts private land negatively, we should respect that as well and reciprocate both ways.
All right. Any other questions or comments? We have Lewick, Representative Lewick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess kind of follow on what Representative Anderson had commented on. If we've got a rational process here that the Department of Agriculture deals with on assessing damage, whether, and again, that frankly should also transfer to the situation where a government entity does something, whether it's spraying weeds or whatever, it would seem like the basis for the bill has got some real problems, because are we going to devalue the circumstance here where private property owners' property may be damaged? And I'm talking about both the underlying bill. But, like I say, I think this amendment makes sense. And, I mean, what's good for the goose, good for the gander here. We're somehow holding this up as being more valuable than a individual property owner's thing. And I think that's it just doesn't, if we got any sanity, any actual rational process, and it's in statute on how these fees are arrived at when you assess a penalty, then if you do X damage, you should be penalized accordingly. And to double it just arbitrarily based on a property line just doesn't make sense. But again, if you're going to do this, then let's do it all the way. Let's do it across the board for both sides of the equation, public and private. There should not be this special favoritism. So I support the amendment, but I certainly disagree with the general approach of the underlying bill, which basically says your property and your damage is worth something less than this damage when they may be exactly the same. That just doesn't seem like how our judicial system works, including our administrative fee assessment system.
Thank you, Representative Lewick. Representative Anderson, closing comments about your amendment.
No final comments, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And Representative Hansen, any other comments?
I would oppose the amendment.
All right. So all in favor of the amendment, which is the A1 amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, nay?
Nay.
The motion does not prevail. The amendment is not adopted. Okay, so we have the bill. Representative Hansen, this is going to be laid over, so any final comments about? Oh, yeah, we did want to see if there's anyone in the audience who wanted to speak in opposition or in support of this bill, House File 1292. You're welcome to come down. I don't see anyone, this bill is to be laid over, so you renew your motion to
Lay it over.
to do so. All right. Thank you. Representative Hansen. Okay, so now Representative Poston has a bill, and that is 2690. So that bill is in your packet. It is a bill that just appropriates a certain amount of money, so no additional fiscal note because we know what the amount is that they're seeking. And welcome, Representative Poston. You can move your bill and then speak to it.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members. I'd like to move House File 2690 for possible inclusion in the Ag Finance Omnibus Bill.
Very well. Okay, so I know you have a testifier, and I know you want to present the bill, so just go ahead.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. House File 2690 appropriates $1 million over the biennium to the 2 Minnesota State Ag Schools of Excellence, Central Lakes College Ag and Energy Center, and South Central College Ag Center. Some of the areas that the colleges focus on are farmer mental health, farm business management support. They help getting new farmers into farming or into other careers in the ag business, and they help with families transitioning their farm from one generation to the next. And in today's world, with the farm economy the way it is and the mental health issues the way they are in agriculture, I think it's very important that we prop up the funding for these 2 schools. With that, I'll introduce Keith Olander. Keith is the Director of Ag Centric at Central Lakes College in Staples.
Welcome to the committee, and you can go ahead and present your testimony. State your name and then present your testimony.
Thank you, Chair Poppe. Keith Olander, as Mr. Representative Poston mentioned, Director of Ag Centric and Dean of Agricultural Studies. Here today to just speak about the center's work, what we do, how we support farmers in this process, and go about describing some of the situations our farmers are facing currently. With that, as mentioned earlier, there's 2 centers of excellence within Minnesota State for the 36 colleges. I'll speak very specifically about the 8 colleges in farm business management and the nearly 3,000 farmers that we work with specifically. Brad Slosher and I work very closely together to serve that audience. We have 65 faculty. We support that. Brad regrettably just couldn't be here today. We had really tight timing on this particular situation, but he brings his supports the comments, and we spoke last evening. with that. Obviously, as we look to the Centers of Excellence overall, we're to engage industry, enhance education, and inspire students. And so we're going to go through a little bit of that. 4 big buckets that we work within is advocacy. We look at that, and literacy for careers in agriculture and for the consumer perspective, and connecting them to farmers and building integrity in our food system. We work a lot in career pathways. Farm business management and rural mental health is a large component of our work, and education and training as we move forward, both within and outside of the context of what we think of agriculture production. So we're looking at that from, again, a consumer perspective as well as students coming through pathways. So how did we get here? Well, we know 2018 was very challenging. As you saw in the reports earlier this week, as we put out the press release, we worked very close with the University of Minnesota, and you saw farm income again was down about 8%. I'm going to point out how that sits within the situation and context of both Minnesota and the state. Going forward, for some clarifying pieces, if you think of soup being made, the university makes the soup, and Minnesota State and Minnesota Farm Business Management provide the ingredients to that soup. So that's kind of how this comes together. We're proud to do that work, and we're glad that we grew the number of farms. However, the data that came out of that was just not positive. This is now the 6th year of low profitability. $26,000 or $12.50 an hour is nothing to brag about, and that's about where our farmers are at today. And they've been doing this now for 6 years in a row. Creates a very difficult situation. Obviously, planting, growing season, harvest, and now winters. We lost the many shelters around the state going forward. It just really created some dire situations, and there's a variance across the state. South Central, Southwest had poor yields, Northwest had greater yields, and Northwest Minnesota, certainly from a financial perspective, probably in better shape. The new Farm Bill also creating a number of challenges, a lot of uncertainty around where the dairy perspective is coming in, what that is actually going to play out, and how it's going to actually help our farmers within that. This chart, awful busy. I really want you to pay attention just basically from 2013 on. Notice how low and flat that income is. 2018 I have not added on, but it's at just over $26,000. A little scenario for you to think about from a jobs perspective. If you made $100,000 in 2010 through 2012, you're now living on $40,000 a year. And your expenses did not change in that time frame. And farmers expect that. We expect volatility. I farm myself. And we expect volatility from year to year. And we expect a down year, but we also expect a positive year. The challenge becomes when we have 6 years in a row of this kind of low income. And how do we overcome that? Let's look at it from a national perspective, if you will. Again, a very busy map, and I know it has a lot to it. Bottom line is Minnesota, we're down 76% in net farm income from the period outlined there from 2011 to 2013 compared to 2016 to 2017. Not a badge of honor we want to wear, but we are the 3rd losing state in terms of context for farm income. Again, I'm just trying to put context around why these funds would be important. If we look at the debt sector, and I'm going to point back, our data goes back, we had the 23rd, in other words, the income that we reflected in the reports earlier this week in the media, that takes us back 23 years ago as to where we were at. And so we're seeing debt levels both on the real estate and non-real estate rise to levels of concern. So the legislation specifically today, how do we look at this? Well, we know from a beginning farmer perspective, it's very challenging to get into the industry. However, our average age of farmer in the United States is 58. Our database is a little younger than that. We have about 600, just shy of 600 farmers enrolled in beginning farmer. Farm business managers, I'm outlining why that is important to help those beginning farmers, but that's the content of our database in terms of how we do that. The other side of that is farm transfer. As I mentioned, the average age of farmer is 58. This is not a job transfer, this is a business transfer. This is often a legacy transfer. And so it involves multiple siblings, children, business owners, and so the transfer of a farm is extensive. And we've engaged in that process on soft monies over the last 2 years, found it very successful, but we need to grow and continue to support our farmers. And it's a means by which in dire times of economics, it's more critical than ever to figure out innovative ways to bring beginning farmers in. This gives you an overview of what Minnesota Farm Business Management covers. Again, I'm just showing you the map. As you see that we have coverage across the state of Minnesota. The colors simply indicate the different colleges we work with. We've been in operation since 1951. There's about 65 faculty that we support and nearly 2,700 students or farmers in this particular case that are enrolled in our program on a consistent basis. The faculty operate very independently and supportive, and our classes do not occur in the colleges. They occur at the kitchen table. in a one-on-one situation, which often when you think about is a very inefficient way, but in the end result, when you're talking about personal finances, business operations, it's the most effective model we found, and it's one of the best in the country in terms of how it operates. What do the students say about the program? They find on average from our survey work and research that they value the program about $12,000 to $13,000 a year annually, either from greater income or reduced cost, and that's through the education process. With additional funding, we want to foster broader access in tough economic times. Two hurdles we had to overcome this year, obviously the storms prevented us from getting to students like we wanted to, and on the other side, we have to charge tuition. That's part of our process and how the program is paid for. That became an economic hurdle. Please understand that a lot of these folks do not have money to allocate day to day for operations. And so coming up with an additional cost is a challenge, but they've done very well at doing so. What do the students get out of this, or the farmers? Benchmarking. We compare them to their peers. They know if they're within the dairy sector, how is it they compare if they milk 150 cows to other 150 cow operations. They grow soybeans, how do they compare in similar sized farms in those particular enterprises? Records. Managing what you measure, critical to the program, critical to any business success. Obviously, guidance and loan, and we often offer a team approach where we're bringing in multiple professionals to these farms. And the biggest thing is to determine resiliency. If you think about 6 years in a row where we've had the low income, and how do you become resilient every year to regenerate the business success from year to year? So how does the legislation help us in this regard? Rural mental health is a major, major issue and a major topic, as Chair Poppe alluded to earlier. We can offer more wraparound services through our faculty and through our staff if we had the availability of resources. I do not want this in any way to conflict with your efforts, and I so appreciate what you're doing in rural mental health to grow the capacity of Mr. Matthews and beyond. So I don't want this to conflict with that. But there are additional resources that we could provide to farmers within that situation. And then because it happens at the kitchen table, it can be very effective in terms of how we could offer those wraparound resources or offered sources. Workshop planning, execution with the faculty is a real critical piece. Most of our faculty are going to see somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 folks this month coming forward as we share the data from 2018 and put context around that. We also continue to want to offer more curriculum pieces. Again, this is not classroom curriculum. This is stuff that happens at the kitchen table. We have comprehensive support across rural mental health specialists in doing that and coordination beyond that. We're really excited if we can grow Ted Matthews into Ted Matthews 2, 3, or 4 and beyond would be great to be able to do that. And again, offer some admin support. Ted and I communicate very regularly, and that's one of the challenges that he has is just managing his own schedule and keeping that up with what the demands are daily for him. In the headlines, and I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this one comes from CBS News, and Chair Poppe alluded to earlier. It's really a sad day, but we're measuring our situation sometimes by the number of suicides we have on a monthly basis, which is really dire. And when we have surpassed the veteran population who we hold up as one that we don't want that to happen there, but when we surpass that, it gets very concerning from an agricultural perspective. Current staff, as you know, is Ted Matthews in rural mental health, and his information is there. That is supported through the Centers of Excellence, and we'll work in that regard. Just a point of note, he has a 1.5 log of hours, which is overwhelming in terms of the work that he does, and again, I appreciate the work that you're doing to do that. So let's look at key takeaways for today. If we look at the context of how this works, there's Rural Mental Health Program, the Centers of Excellence, Farm Business Management, and again, our partner, Minnesota Department of Ag. They've been very good at offering some scholarships to those early career farmers, and we continue that relationship as how do we cooperatively work to serve farmers for that. Our rural mental health specialists, again, kitchen table, referrals from the FBM. And the key point here is that rural mental health and farm business management have grown over the years, in fact, for over 2 decades successfully because of that model. And so we've got to keep that in mind as we move legislation forward, that model be the base of that legislation as we continue forward. And of course, there operates on the road, and our FBM faculty do that in that capacity already. Been very effective as we go forward. At this point, I would entertain any questions around this. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you, and certainly see this as a situation right now in agriculture as very dire. I experience it personally as a farmer. I have neighbors that are going out of business around me on a regular basis, and this is not a situation to take lightly. I did offer some materials, including a letter from my particular president, as well as an outline of the overall activities that we complete within farm business management and specific to ag-centric. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Olander. And we do have some questions. So we're going to start Representative Miller.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Olander, for coming here today and presenting. Great presentation, by the way. If you can keep my attention, you've done a good job because I have a very short attention span. And that was really good. I do have one question, and I thank you for these programs. I think this is one of those programs that work really well. And I just jotted in my notes, I said, you talked about a lot of the challenges in farming now. Not a lot of optimism this year. There's some optimism in, farmers know how to get to work and stuff like that. So I'm seeing a lot of that out in my district. But one of the things that Representative Poston said in the beginning is the, the opportunities for the young people here. And so what are some of those career paths outside of actual farming that might be available to them? If you could describe just one or two of those. And then what are you telling the young people when they're coming in and they hear all this, it's going to be tough, it's going to be hard and stuff like that, but here's why you should do it. What's basically that conversation look like? So what are the opportunities outside of the farm that you're talking about, and kind of what's the messaging to the young people to get them engaged?
Yep.
Mr.
Thank
Glenn.
you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Miller. So there's really, I can almost speak out of two sides of my mouth. In production agriculture, we have 2% of the population engaged. That particular segment, certainly in an economic situation, very dire. But if I split that off in terms of the opportunities within agribusiness or any of the pathways within agriculture, very, very strong. We are top 5 in the country in terms of compensation, and we usually have 2 to 3 jobs per graduate. So in that regard, when I speak with young people, it's maybe not the opportunity on the farm, but those that support the system from the farm to the table. That demand and that demographic is growing at an exponential rate, especially as we look forward to feeding 9 billion people by 2050. We have got to create 70% more food than we now create. And that's kind of an oxymoron when you look at, well, why don't the markets increase? The fact of the matter is they're going to come along, but the other side of that is we're going to do it with different technology than we've done in the past. So the opportunity within agriculture is stronger now than ever before. I'll give you a personal note beyond that. I graduated back in the 80s. Every farm at that time said run, including my parents, right? I didn't listen, okay? But that being said, I graduated through the university. There was 4 or 5 of us coming through at that time. And it was that outlook that there really wasn't a lot of opportunity because the whole economic situation was a downturn. And certainly we have that in production agriculture. But let's not mistake that for what the opportunities are within agriculture in general. We need graduates, and we need them now.
All right, Representative Lippert.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and to the testifier. I want to be sure that I'm clear on the wraparound services for mental health that you want to put in place. So if you could just walk me through that again, just as far as like what's in place now, what would this allow you to do? I just want to, there was a lot going by. I want to make sure that I'm clear on that.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate the question. So right now we have Ted Matthews. One, I've got somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 folks that he'll work with. The odds, it just doesn't work, right? But he's done his best over that time. So then Brad and I, through the centers, we try to help coordinate some of his schedule pieces very loosely. Wraparound services to go beyond that. Number one, you've already done work, and I appreciate, to make more TEDs, which could actually do the work with the farmer. But there's another gap that exists between here about some of our faculty in terms of some of the curriculum pieces in helping farmers identify when are situations that come about where I need to be reaching out for help, and then what does it look like within my family dynamic and family health within a family business. Those are some curriculum pieces that are very important that we'd like to continue to bring forward. The other side of that is a farm-family communication. And we're seeing more of a breakdown more now than ever, that we would be instrumental, and I call it farm transition, but it's that idea of a transition in a farm usually will take place over a decade. And so there takes an ongoing support piece that's a layer necessarily, if I could say, below TED services that are important, that can be part of farm business management, but there's kind of that middle layer in there, what I would call a wraparound service, that could clarify some of the family communications and not get us off track, and then eventually lead us down the road, not that I want to go to a suicide, but just a flat-out depression that's there. The other side of that is new and innovative ways that we can add in new enterprises to that, or look at demographics. As we looked at off-farm income, grew in the database about 10% this year. And so how does that look, and start looking at models to help mental health right on the farm just by creating different methods of revenue. We were 6 years in. I don't have a crystal ball. I know 2019 right now does not look pleasant. I'm hoping sooner than later. But what happens if we've got 3 to 4 more years of this? We've got to be very creative on how we support farmers. And I think our faculty can take additional steps to do that, but we need to be able to help them in the curriculum places to be able to do that. Does that help answer the question?
Representative Lippert.
Madam Chair, yes, it does. And if I can just restate it in my own terms. So it sounds like one piece is just work with farmers within the curriculum for some increased mental health awareness.
Yes.
So they have an understanding of when there's some warning signs that need to be paid attention to. Another is related to times in a farmer's life when it may be particularly difficult around transition of the business from family members to one another, helping with communication to make sure that process can go as smoothly as possible. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Mr. Olander.
And then another is just kind of trying to create more opportunities for hope related to economic opportunities. Am I restating that accurately?
Yes. If I could, Madam Chair, Representative Lippert, the only piece that I would add on to that is we work with several lenders and the Farm Service Agency and folks, even like veterinarians that work with farmers. And we found last year we did a project with the Minnesota Department of Ag we called Down on the Farm. And we had over 400 attendees to that. And so it's also working with people that work with farmers. And are there additional pieces of support mechanisms we can put in place in that team model around the farm? As these farms grow larger and you have a team approach, I think there's also opportunity for us there as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
All right, we're going to wrap this up by 1:45. So we have about 8 minutes, and we have a number of people on the list. So Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is, when you're talking rural mental health, are you doing any outreach on tribal reservations? What's your demographic outreach when you're working in rural areas? Are you going to the reservations? Are you involving potential new farmers? Also with Southeast Asian outreach, I'd just like to know are you going to traditional farmers? Are you engaging other people in farm business management? And also when dealing with rural mental health, because I've heard two different ways, rural mental health or farmer mental health. And so I think we have evidence that there's a variety of problems out there. They may be small businesses that are crashing in small towns too that are related to agriculture. So just those are my two questions.
Mr. Olander.
Thank you. I appreciate that question. So in the regard to the farmer mental health, obviously is our clearest directive. However, we've now engaged in conversations on the tribal level, I would say very moderately in terms of what the support is and how do we build in models of sustainability in agriculture in that regard for them, and more from a local foods perspective in my conversations with them. We do have a couple faculty that work very closely with Hmong America, or HAFA, in that regard as well to support. So I agree with you, there are pockets of rural that we are probably missing, but by and large we impact a large area as I demonstrated by the map and geographic of Minnesota with that. So are we comprehensive? I would say probably not totally, but I think we do one of the most effective jobs in terms of serving rural Minnesota.
Okay, and we'll ask people to be succinct in their questions and in the responses. Representative Wozlowick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm wondering to the testifier, perhaps this question is better suited. What is the process like for deciding how the grant money is spent in terms of what you prioritize? I'm just wondering if you could detail that. And then is there any report back, or do we see kind of where that money went so we have an understanding of what it was spent on?
Mr. Olander.
Madam Chair, Representative Wozniak, I certainly appreciate that. Yes, so we have the ability right now, because any of our soft monies that would go in the farm transition world, we're already doing reporting back, and we'd be happy to report back to you in terms of both the numbers that are engaged in that process, how the process is going, and as well as the survey work behind that, going down that. And I lost my other train of thought, I'm sorry, but my world works, I work on a number of grant fronts, and so reporting back is certainly something. I really impaired with my staff and the faculty we work with that we demonstrate results. The other thing I will tell you, if you work with farmers very long at all, if you do not demonstrate results, they don't have time for you. And so it's implied within my position that I demonstrate results. So I appreciate that.
Okay. Representative Brand.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll just say briefly, if you have any demographic information that you could share with us about the students, who the makeup is, how many males, females, different racial demographics, we just know the world's changing. And we know agriculture is going to change too, one way or the other. And it would be really interesting, and maybe I could even bug one of my constituents, Brad Slosher, about the information too, but I would just love to know for my own iteration about what's going on in agriculture and how we could maybe help things along in talking about diversification of need and diversification of culture. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Representative Lewitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Question on, just in ballpark terms, what kind of tuition is involved over an annual basis for somebody involved in the farm business program?
Mr. Olander.
Madam Chair, Representative Lewis, appreciate that question. Roughly about $1,800 a year is what we consider a full-time student within farm business management.
And follow up, roughly how many contacts would you estimate that your staff would have with that, one particular individual farm
Mr. Olander.
through that course of that process?
Yep. Appreciate the opportunity, Representative Lewick. About 50 farms is what they run. They need to carry at least 35. We'll see some as high as 85 right now, which is concerning to me from their stress perspective, but they do not want to say no to a particular farmer.
Yeah. No, I'll just very quickly, Madam Chair, say, this is an excellent program. I'm generally familiar with it because part of the things we did in our local Farm Bureau County chapter is we actually provide scholarships to get our young people, they want to come into farming or take over dad's farm, is in fact, they do enroll in your program. And in fact, we've got a couple of, I'll say youngsters, that's a generational thing, that are still at it. And they went in right at that peak when it really looked good. And thank goodness they're still there. But that day-to-day, being able to have somebody else look at the numbers, look at the plan, or come and ask you, this is what's going on here, you're planning for that, is really helpful, and really appreciate that. So this is more than worth the investment here, really across the state of Minnesota. So thank you.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll speak quickly. Mr. Olander, thanks for being here. You're an excellent voice to get this story out to the public. Question about your comment about wraparound to help your staff. I think we know that your FBM folks are pretty well maxed out, as is Ted Matthews. So would these funds help get more boots on the ground to make contact with farmers?
Mr. Olander.
Madam Chair, Representative Anderson, I appreciate the question. Certainly, we can do the wraparound services are also to provide additional support to faculty, so we can help adjust their schedule. And certainly, as we come to the analysis season, there's some pieces of that work that can be wrapped into what I would consider support services. Certainly.
Representative Anderson.
And one more quick one. One of the things I haven't heard mentioned, marketing can play a huge difference in terms of a small loss or maybe a small gain. Do you work with the marketing aspect too with farmers, especially grain farmers?
Mr. Olander.
Yes, Representative Poppe actually a couple of years ago helped us to establish some online pieces in which we're now delivering some online marketing piece, and we continue to grow that and expand across the state as well. So absolutely, I agree with you completely. Marketing is the key, and to one of the avenues as to how do we navigate through this process. So I appreciate that question, Representative Anderson.
Representative Keel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Representative Anderson asked a couple of my questions, so I would just like to reaffirm this is a great program. I thank you, Mr. Olander, for being here, and Representative Poston for bringing this forward. My farm is in transition, and my son has taken advantage of this program. I, too, have been part of the marketing before I showed up here. But it is a very important, the other thing I would point out is I find a lot of my local businesses, young people that end up in some of these ag businesses that are extensions, students that graduate. I can think of one of my bankers actually that's trying to farm along with doing ag banking. So there's a lot of different avenues that are helping with this program. And I know that they're also trying to connect new farmers with young farmers with this. So there's a lot of help out there and very important program. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a question. Mr. Olander, have you had the conversations within MnState to talk about increasing the funds to the centers of ag?
Yes, because we've just been aware of that this week, Min-State is aware of this particular proposal and moving it forward, and yes.
I think my question is actually, we're not the higher ed committee, and I've made that comment before, that sometimes, people come to the ag committee, which has the smallest budget, but they want, they'd like to get something for it. And I've said this about the University of Minnesota, and so just on Min-State as well, that, if they're underfunding certain aspects of the enterprise, maybe they need to be made aware that they're doing that and that you would like to see more money, because this is truly important. And we do want to make sure that the agriculture sector is supported as much as possible through higher education and through all of that. So that's my editorial comment on that. And then I'll just make one other comment about wraparound services, since I'm a counselor at a community college that has FBM instructors. And I will say that, sometimes we're not always as engaged as maybe we could be or should be. So I would just invite you to, from the campus perspective, include more of the counselors, because that might be another option to be able to use if you're running short with Ted Matthews' time and energy. So that would be my comments. Anybody else have any questions? And is there anyone in the audience that wanted to speak in support or opposition to this proposal? Otherwise, Representative Poston, final comments.
Well, Madam Chair, thank you. I just will reiterate what I said earlier. I think right now, perhaps more importantly than ever before, these programs need to be funded correctly, and we need to continue to support them. So with that, I would just ask for your support, and I would ask that I renew my motion that House File 2690 be laid over for possible inclusion in the Ag Finance Omnibus Bill.
Thank you, Representative Poston. Thank you, Mr. Olander. Great presentation. Very much appreciate that you came down to do this. So thank you.
Thank you, Chair Poppe.
Yes. Okay, so now we are moving on. We've got some time blocked now, the rest of the time, to be able to talk about chronic wasting disease. So people have this in their packet. It is actually just H2200A1 is what we're going to be looking at. We had a couple of weeks ago now, some bills that came before us, had some discussion about that. Since that time, I've gotten personally more engaged in this process, just because I think it's certainly an important one, and we want to make sure that we try to hear from all aspects and be able to maybe come up with something that could be a little bit more less concerning to some, more agreeable to all, and try to come up with that. So we really were, so I've been working on this. What we're doing today is we're just bringing this before us. We're actually not moving it. This is language that could be in Article 2 of House File 2200, but we previously had not moved 2200, and we didn't bring that up today. So it's really just a discussion item, but people do have it in their packets, and I'm actually going to walk through it a little bit, and then I know we have people here who want to speak about this. So I just want to kind of, if you'll pull out the H2200A1, and I'll just kind of go through it so that people know what I'm talking about, okay? And reasons why we did certain things, or why it got written this way. So I'm just going to start on page 1. We do have it as Article 2, Farm Server Day. And 1.13, 1.14, there was the high tensile fence that was initially just considered that would have to be the case, and I actually added that it could be comprised of 2 or more rows of fencing or 1 high tensile fence. They're both going to be at the same height, but some farmers that I talked to already had double fencing, and so I didn't want them to have to then do the high tensile fence if they've got double fencing. So it's kind of, it's actually to try to hopefully broaden it, and more people would have one or the other. So that's for that purpose. The other was the 2 redundant gates. So if anybody has, is unfamiliar with that, that's like if you take your dog to the dog park, that you probably have that first one, you go in, you've got that little enclosure, and then you go into the next. So that's really the concept there, and I think that a lot of people have determined that that's an agreeable action to take, that they would like to see that happen. I did, and I know I'm actually using the base. Representative Becker-Finn had some bills. Representative Herr had the depopulation bill. Other people have had some interest in this. So some of this is language from them, but I've modified it. So if you'll see on 1.22, it talks about if there are more than 2 escape incidents. And then up to 2.1, we were looking at that the Board of Animal Health may revoke the facility's registration and the animals may be seized. That is a change. I think, some people would want to say shall, that those things shall happen, that they would be expected to happen. I'm softening that a bit and saying it's may. But I do think, clearly the problem is we don't want the animals to get loose, and we don't want things to happen if we can avoid it. And so avoidance would happen if you can fence them in and gate them in and not have them get loose. But I think it's very rare, actually, that they have 2 or more escape kind of situations. So it's probably a rare incident, but that's the change there. That they would have an identifier, that a distinct number that's not been used in the previous 3 years. The change on there is 2.8, that the date instead of December 31st would be November 30th. That has been a worked and changed number. I think it was September 15th at one point. I initially thought October 31st. The big reason for this is the babies need to be weaned. So the fawns need to be weaned, if we're talking about white-tailed deer, and as close as possible to a date when that's likely to be have occurred, because otherwise mamas are concerned about their babies, and that might cause a problem. So we want to make sure that we are covering both. That they do have the identifying tag, but that also it's at a date that might be agreeable. And again, this may or may not be agreeable. I'm just telling you this is the changes that have been made, and we're open to continuing to work on this. Then 2.9, 2.10, the Commissioner of Natural Resources may destroy an animal that's not identified. Again, permissive, possible. Then probably a change down on 2.24 to 2.31, talks about the Board of Animal Health inspects each farm survey facility annually, and then the Board of Animal Health, could ask the Commissioner of Agriculture to assist with those annual inspections. And what was taken out of there was to also ask the DNR to assist. And I know that the deer farmers were concerned about the DNR maybe having the ability to do an annual inspection. The DNR can inspect if they have a suspicion, and that's later language, but in this particular area where it's an annual inspection, it would be the Board of Animal Health, and possibly it would be with the Department of Ag if they needed assistance. 3.5 to 3.9 does talk about if the owner does not repair the fence deficiencies within a reasonable period of time. And that was a change, rather than stating a certain, it's like the 48 hours or 3 weeks or 6 months or whatever. It has to be a reasonable period of time. And that reasonable period of time can shift depending on the season, probably, because there might be easier times to fix a fence than other times. So that's going to be determined by the board. And so that's the change there. 3.8, again, it may revoke the owner's registration and the owners may be destroyed. Again, that's going to be conversations that the Board of Animal Health can have. Then we get down to some fees. And 3.12 to 3.14 talks about the herd fee and increasing the herd fee. There was some discussion about having commercial and non-commercial herds. What I've understood is sometimes that could fluctuate. You could start out with a non-commercial herd and then maybe decide that you're going to start selling some of those animals, and that becomes a commercial herd. So it's maybe to level the playing field, that there isn't necessarily a lot of non-commercial ones, but those that just have some deer in their yard that they have, they would also be at the same standard. So they'd be paying, so everyone The inspection fee would increase to $500 unless an owner sells the ability to shoot animals in the herd. In that case, it would be $1,000. Now, this is a significant change because it was, they had to pay $10 per cervid up to $100, so it's a significant bump, but it would allow for the Board of Animal Health to actually have inspectors to be able to come and look at the fencing and look at the herds. So that's, again, that may be something that, people might have some heartburn over, but just so you know that. Then the next is 3.15 to 3.18. I think there was a concern about whether or not, how do people get paid? And whether or not the state should have an indemnity fund or not. But what this would do, 3.15 to 3.18, is allow for a payment, $10 per cervid the first year, $5 per cervid each year thereafter. That would be deposited in a reimbursement and indemnity account. And the first year, they'd probably raise around $100,000 and $50,000 each year after that. If you have a valuable herd and it happens to be get CWD, that's going to be a quite costly thing to try to pay. And our approach, hopefully, would be that people would go to the federal government first, because the USDA can and does have funds for that. So, but this would be something. So again, this might be might have some questions about that. Then the next 3.19 to 3.22 just talks again about that amount that would be in the indemnity fund that we want it, if it gets up to $500,000, that would kind of be the cap. If it falls below 250, that we'd have to kick it back in. So kind of a click on, click off a little bit based on the usage of that fund. There was a contested case hearing, a 3.26 to 3.27 option that you'd have 30 days to be able to talk about that. Then we go on to page 4. Page 4.1 to 4.3, and probably I know there are people in the audience that don't like this one in particular, because this is saying that there would not be allow a new registration for white-tailed deer after July 1 of 2019. That's to put a moratorium out there, but again, that's the discussion point. There is a herd depopulation when we get to 4.13. That would be if an animal in a farm survey herd tests positive, that the entire herd must be euthanized and disposed of in a manner and within a reasonable period of time determined by the board. And if the owner pays for the euthanization and disposal, the owner is eligible for reimbursement. So this isn't saying that they won't get money, and it's not necessarily guaranteeing that they will, except from the federal government, but it does say that there's an indemnity fund, so they're going to be able to seek reimbursement from the indemnity fund. So some language was changed there, so it's I think softer, but that's kind of where that lays. And after they euthanize and dispose of the herd, then some of the requirements here that there's that it would continue to be posted and that continue to be fenced, and that there would be a posting. The board would determine what that posting would read, but that there'd be something. And I know in other bills there have been language about, should it go through the Register of Deeds and other things like that. None of that is in here. This is just saying this is how people would know about that, through posting and that process. This is where the farmed, Section 9 starts, the Farm Survey Reimbursement and Indemnity Program, talks about that, talks about the eligibility. Again, the idea would be that you'd go to the USDA, go to the federal government, they would hopefully act and give money first, and then indemnity is if there isn't a federal opportunity to get that money. So, and so I think that's really what it talks about. And what the animal's value would be is 5.14 to 5.17. the USDA has an appraisal calculator that would be used to determine the value, and it would be, the animal would be valued prior to chronic wasting disease. So it would be what would be a healthy animal value. And that, I think, is what this is. So I'm open to comments, questions, discussion amongst committee members, and will also certainly invite anyone who wants to come down and provide any testimony in support or opposition or challenge any part of this to say this is what they like or not like. And Representative Lueck, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess on 2.2 and 2.9 on page 2, are we talking about animals that would be seized and destroyed by the Commissioner of Natural Resources as animals outside of the fence, or does your language simply allow the Department of Natural Resources essentially seize the farm and destroy all the animals on the farm, even if they're in the fence?
Good question. The animals under 2.2 would be probably the animals within the fence that if the board may revoke the facility's registration, the animals may be seized and destroyed. That would be that case. And the same would be true on 2.9 and 2.10. So it would be the farm
So
service.
you're talking about, you're going to destroy the livestock on the farm, period,
That's what that states.
based on an issue with a fence.
Based on the issue of the fence or the identification.
Yeah. A second part of that, have you worked out the details of how the Commissioner of DNR would legally take possession or, whenever I mean, is this going to be like eminent domain? We've got a whole list of ways that the government can step in and do something. Exactly how would that happen? I mean, in other words, I think I'm going to do it today, Commissioner, and yeah, I mean, we're talking about a pretty extensive process
Thank
there.
you,
even to-
Representative Lueck. I do
Yeah.
not have a plan in place. I'm just providing some language and opportunity to talk about it, and you raise a good question. I know that I've heard from people that the taking of animals and using that terminology, and so and again, this may be a bridge too far, and maybe there's something else that would be need to be written in, or a different process to be done.
Well, I was just going to say, I would ask that you, and this is, you're pretty well-grounded and experienced in agriculture too. There's a well-worn path that goes through the indemnity and condemning of a herd. And last time I looked, I don't think the DNR could even find out which volume of federal law and state law that we have to deal with. So I would suggest that, one, you got the wrong player in there. Department of Agriculture and Board of Animal Health have been up to their ears in dealing with having to destroy livestock. So I don't know, if the DNR wants to jump in and become a third party, that's wonderful. I guess going a little bit further down, and I guess, certainly if you have issues that there's clear negligence on fences, that's a problem, and we simply can't tolerate that. And I don't care if you're raising deer or you're raising dairy cows, or in my case, beef cows. I know what'll happen to my insurance and everything else if an animal gets out and somebody happens to accidentally hit it with a car by simply not their fault. It's my fault because the animal was not allowed to be out there where it could endanger the public. But I would hope that, offense deficiency, that we might want to define that or look at that. I mean, I'm just thinking of about every other year we have these tornado comes through and literally destroys fences, and then sometimes twice in the same summer. So we really got to, I don't know, that's, putting that in the statute gets pretty tough. I guess the other area, again, on how we would deal with making sure that we, when we do get to a situation where, whether it's by owner agreement, however it happens, this business of creating a second process that would provide indemnification or some type of compensation for the value of the animals lost. I don't see, I'm not sure how this would work. I know you have to be extremely careful if you collect a penny of federal indemnity for an animal loss, because if you've got insurance, if that animal's salvageable for food value, that comes out of that formula. So this doesn't appear to make a hard linkage to how that would work. I mean, I can see that if we could get a situation if somebody did collect any federal indemnity and also were eligible for this program, because there's a hard cap on federal indemnity, they could end up having, if they collected from this program, I can tell you what the federal government's likely going to do. They're going to come back and give them a choice. Pay it back right now, or we're going to charge you with fraud. So, I mean, that's one that is really touchy from the standpoint, and the reason we say that is, we had the whole rash of tuberculosis issue, and then we've had avian flu, and you have to be very, very careful about staying out of legal trouble if you collect any kind of indemnity. So unless this has really been through the ringer with the lawyers, this looks like a big leap. Anyway, that's just two insights that I would offer, Madam Chair.
I think you raised valuable insights and very much appreciated. And I think if you have suggestions, this is a work in progress. It really, and I know that the people that are in the room that are sitting, that are the deer farmers, deer hunters, the elk breeders, there's a lot of people, MDA, Board of Animal Health, all of the DNR. There's lots of sides to this issue, and just trying to get to a point where, and this can slim down to be a one-page, bill eventually if there's maybe only that much agreement on things. But I think it's important for us to have the discussion. So I appreciate that, Representative Lewick. So if you have specific, like ideas. Yeah, perfect. Excellent. Anybody else? Representative Anderson.
I thought there was a long list, but thank you, Madam Chair. The two things that concern me here, and first I want to say that I think we learned with the buffer law that when you make something mandatory, you make it a lot more complicated and more difficult. And my comment on the indemnity fund, I've heard some of these breeding deer are extremely valuable. $100,000 for a buck that throws babies with big antlers and such. So how we would value these deer, to me, is a problem. I don't know what this appraisal thing with USDA is, but if they would use that to determine their breeding value, we could get some really, really high numbers. So the $500,000, or what do you have, whatever sum you had in here, it may be a drop in the bucket if one of these herds of really expensive animals would have to be put down. So again, when you make a mandatory program, there's a lot of things that enter into it. My other concern on page 4, top of the page, the moratorium, and I asked the question back when we had testimony earlier, if this would in fact stop a father from transitioning his deer farm to his son, and at that time nobody had the answer. So I'm really concerned about that. That's a big deal, and especially so if a father or a family couldn't pass their farm on down to the next generation. And if they couldn't, I would be very, very opposed to that regulation, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Representative Anderson. Appreciate that. And I'm going to make sure that we have people, if we have people in the audience, this is your opportunity now to just come down. And what I did was met individually with a lot of different people, but I did not meet collectively with a group of people. So trying to hear what people had to say, what they might support, what they might oppose, what they might agree with, and what they would find totally objectionable. So, like I said, this bill is not at the point where it needs to be, but it's an attempt. So, welcome to the committee, Mr. Quillis. So, just
Morning. I want to turn around. It is still morning, and I think it's Thursday. Good morning, Madam Chair, members of the committee. My name is Tony Quillis, and I'm representing the Minnesota Elk Breeders Association, about 80 members in the state, and we have about 75 of the 87 counties where we have members. I want to thank Representative Poppe, who has, I think it's her counselor background, to try and bring some diversified folks with some thoughts together on this issue. And I think it's an important conversation to have. And Representative Hansen started it, and other folks, Representative Hamilton, yourself, Representative Tapke had an amendment earlier that we discussed. It's an important conversation to have about the state, because I don't think anybody, all the stakeholders involved, whether it's the deer hunters, the deer breeders, the elk breeders, the Board of Animal Health, the DNR, none of us want it in the state of Minnesota. We know the tourism economic impact. I'm looking at Representative Eklund. I have a hunting camp myself up around his district. Madam Chair, so we know the economic impact and what happens in around this, and whether or not it's going to affect our state. So it's very important, and all of us don't want it here. Unfortunately, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, I think it's going to get here, and then the next discussion is how to slow its growth. And so we've been having that discussion in various venues and how to go through it, and this is kind of the latest venue at it. And Madam Chair, if I could, to just go through it very quickly, and Representative Lewick touched on one of the points I want to talk about, and is when we talked about the redundant gates to go through, and I've had some very preliminary discussions with yourself and with Commissioner Peterson over at the Department of Agriculture about, you and I discussed probably some livestock, if we could see some livestock grants and loans there, some Rural Finance Authority grants and loans for these redundant gates, because it is a cost to the folks that are going to have to put these up. And so to see if there's a way to do some low interest loans or grants. And then one other thing, Madam Chair, to find when they're going to be required, because if there's an immediate effective date after this, we probably need some time to be able to assemble those, Madam Chair. To go back to Representative Lewick's point, there kind of 2 points there on the gates and the escapes. The fence deficiency, I think the perfect example is what happened this winter, and what we had with some very severe weather up in both parts, all over the state of Minnesota. So especially down by Harmony, where Representative Hansen's farm is, if something happened down in there, I thank you for the reasonable amount of time language, because I'm not sure how far that snow has melted down there yet, if you could even get to that fence yet still. So to repair it. And then the second part, so natural disasters, Madam Chair, and then if you're just one of the most unlucky folks in the world, you have a natural disaster, the fence goes down, and then somebody loses control of their car and goes through it again. And so now you've got two, and now I've got the possibility of the Department of Natural Resources may, I thank you for that, but may destroy the herd. So just some things to talk about. I understand this is a working document as we go through. I just wanted to point those out to you. You talked about previously on page 2.8, when previously we had been talking about trying to tag the deer and when time. September 15th had been mentioned before. You had moved to November 30th. In law right now, it is December 31st. I just wanted to point out, and you talked about, yearlings and how small they are, and I call it running it through the chute. We run animals through the chute a couple times a year for various things, for testing, to put tags on them, to check tags. We have a veterinarian there to do that. These animals are very small at that time of the year, and also at that time of the year, it's kind of the end of the rut. So mom gets a little protective, and dad likes to get involved as you try to go in to tag the animal. So just to keep that in mind also, Madam Chair. Thank you again for the reasonable amount of time under the to repairing the fence deficiencies. And as pointed out, there's three areas there where the Department of Natural Resources may destroy herds. So we want to have a discussion probably around that a little bit more. Madam Chair, I just wanted to point out the financial concerns. Right now, our folks pay $100 because that's what the cap is. And under this, our average herd size 42. I'm terrible at math, so I'm going to just say 50. The inspection fee would be $500. I have 50. I've got another $500. I just went from 100 to 1,000. And then depending on whether or not I can get the loan or the grants, I've got a redundant gate plus 1,000. So just there's a financial cost there and understanding, but willing to work through that with you, Madam Chair. And then with the money going into the fund, we were trying as a board, trying to work our way through this because we haven't seen this before. And so we're trying to analyze it. We haven't seen any other state to try and compare it to. So we'd like some time to try and analyze it. I think a credit to you to think outside the box, to look at a different way to look at this. So we just like a little bit more time to kind of analyze how to work through that. I think there was some discussions about how it would work with the federal funds and if those are available. But thank you, Madam Chair, for moving this ball forward a little bit more and allowing us in discussion. And we're more than willing to be happy to provide background information or anything that you need. But I would be remiss, Madam Chair, if I didn't leave this table and turn it over to Mr. Sprecht and others that there are some concerns in terms of natural deer movement on what we have in our borders right now in Iowa and Wisconsin. And also a couple of other quick concerns dealing with taxidermy and also with carcass movement from folks that go and hunt in other states and move and import those in and out of there, Madam Chair. And then also one final point. I think we should look with our congressmen and where they are right now at obtaining some federal funding with Congressman Peterson and maybe Congressman McCollum. I think that there is a bill right now moving on the federal level, and if we can get any sort of money to the University of Minnesota or to us for further research and development, I think that would be great, Madam Chair. And again, thank you for the time. I really appreciate it, and thank you for moving the ball forward.
Thank you, Mr. Quillis. Mr. Sprecht, welcome.
Madam Chair and committee members, good morning. Tim Sprecht with the Minnesota Deer Farmers. I also want to commend you, Madam Chair. In fact, as I'm sitting here, I can see a faint halo above your head. So I want to commend you for being there for us, for bringing us to the table, and for letting all the interested and concerned parties have a voice in this process. And with regard specifically to the language of the bill, there are a few areas I'd like to point out. And as you've mentioned earlier, and we also greatly appreciate this as being a work in progress, we look forward to having additional discussion as well. On line 1.13, 1.14, we do appreciate you giving us a choice on the fencing. The area of concern we do have is that there are people that have installed fencing that was completely commensurate with the current law at the correct height, and now all of a sudden they would have to either do double fencing or high tensile, which would mean either adding to or ripping out and starting over. So I think if they are able to pass current inspections, there are no deficiencies within the fencing, we should look at grandfathering those folks in, because if they just spent $50,000 fencing 2 years ago and now all of a sudden they have to spend another 50, we want to be very cautious because that's almost a farm ending type of an expense for these folks. The double gate, redundant gate area, as I mentioned to you in discussions we've had, this is something that we're pretty good with most of the language, and it makes a lot of sense as a compromise position. I think we all know from discussions that we've had here that almost all of the escapes, of the small number of escapes, do happen at the gate. So if we can find a way to appease concerns of folks about escapes by doing the double gating, we are supportive of that. Beginning on line 1.22 and continuing to 1.22 and continuing to 2.1, we do have concern about this specific language as it does represent a taking without compensation. So we'd want to be cautious that we're not running afoul of the law. Maybe there can be something done with that language that would be helpful in that area. Then that brings me to line 2.8. We want to thank the chair for considering our input on the weaning of fawns, as the date has been set here at November 30, which is the date that we are fine with, and we do appreciate your consideration on that.